Good morning. I've been reflecting quite a bit over the last several days about this concept in the scriptures of standing in the gap, And I wanted to reflect a little bit on that with you this morning. We get this expression to stand in the gap in Ezekiel chapter 22. And it's at the end of a rather long chapter where God is expressing his anger and his frustration with the people of Israel. And then in verse 30 of Ezekiel 22, he says, I looked for someone among them, that's among the people of Israel returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the city. He says, I was looking for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap. And stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so that I would not have to destroy it. So God, who was really frustrated with the people of Israel, is looking for somebody who would stand in the gap of the wall on behalf of the people of Israel. And as soon as we start using this language, on behalf of, we're suggesting that somebody is advocating for somebody else. That someone is taking on the role of speaking on behalf of other people. Now, unfortunately, in the Ezekiel story, God says, but I found no one. He could not find a single person who was willing to stand in the gap on behalf of Israel. And so he says in the last verse of chapter 22 of Ezekiel, so I will pour out my wrath on them and consume them with my fiery anger, bringing down on their heads all that they have done, declares the sovereign Lord. What God wanted was a person who would stand in the gap of the wall. Now we must think of the wall around Jerusalem, which had been destroyed, as being something that would protect the people inside the city from danger outside the city. The job of the wall is to provide protection and to champion the well-being and the safety and the capacity of people to flourish. And what God is describing for us is someone who stands in the gap in the wall. He's looking for someone who could stand in that gap and almost fill the gap with their physical presence. That's this image that we get here in Ezekiel. That's such a beautiful and powerful image. So while in Ezekiel, God could not find anybody willing or able to stand in the gap, in the Exodus story, we do find someone. And we read about this first in Psalm 106. In Psalm 106, we get a long litany of all the sins of the people of Israel while they were traveling through the desert for those 40 years. And then in verse 23, we read, so God said he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood in the gap before him to keep his wrath from destroying them. Let me read that again. Psalm 106, verse 23. So God said he would destroy them, the people of Israel, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood in the gap before him to keep his wrath from destroying them. So here again, God is looking for somebody who is willing to stand in the gap and to advocate for or intercede on behalf of the people of Israel. And in this case, Moses was just such a person, chosen to be that person who was willing to stand in the gap and face the wrath of God. Now, I want you to just listen to a little bit of the story where on which the psalm is based. And this comes from Exodus, another E. It comes from Exodus chapter 32, which is the chapter about the golden calf. So we remember Moses went up the mountain, and while he was there, the people all went a bit bananas, and they built the golden calf, and they were worshipping it. And when Moses came down, he was really upset. He broke the stone tablets with the law written on it, and God was really angry. And so we get this verse in Ezekiel 32, verse 9, God says, I have seen these people, he says to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone in my anger, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them, and then I will make you into a great nation. So once again, God is fed up with the people of Israel, and he is threatening this anger. And then in verse 11 we read, but Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. And he said, Lord, why would your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great and powerful and mighty hand? Why would the Egyptians say it was with an evil intent that he brought them out? And he continues over the next several verses to make a case to God about why God should not destroy his people, because they are his people. And he continues around this for several verses. And then in verse 13 he says, remember your servants to whom you swore to your own self. And he calls on God to turn from your fierce anger, to relent, and to not bring disaster on your people. And then it culminates in verse 14, Exodus 32, verse 14, with this profound verse. I actually think this is one of the most striking and remarkable verses in the scriptures. It says, Then the Lord relented, and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Moses stood in the gap on behalf of the people of Israel, and he engaged with the Lord, with our God, to turn aside his anger. He stood in the gap. He took up this role of speaking on behalf of advocating for or interceding for people who were under threat, in this case, by God himself. And he speaks truth to power. And in the process of doing that, God relents. In other words, he turns his anger away. He, in a way, changes his mind. It's quite a powerful verse, this. So what would it mean for us now in the 21st century, and particularly during this time of COVID? What does it mean for us to stand in the gap? I think it means two main things. The first is, it is those times when people or animals or the world itself or systems are under great threat and need someone to stand up for them and to speak on their behalf. Standing in the gap means to take on that role of advocating, of advocacy, of intercession, of social action, if you want, of pleading the case of somebody against somebody, or to somebody, if you want, who has power. It's a courageous role, and in the scriptures we don't hear about it often, but we hear about it in relation to Ezekiel and Moses, two great heroes of our faith. So the first thing is to identify those places where somebody needs standing up for. And the second thing that it requires is for us to stand up on their behalf. And I think that this standing in the gap can take on many different forms, depending on who you are and the kinds of gifts that God has given you. So for some of us, it will mean praying on behalf of or for other people. For some of us, it might mean giving something that we have, giving out of our own wealth and our own resources, giving to somebody something that they need in order to get ahead in their lives. For others of us, it might be to write a letter to somebody in power or in authority to argue for a change of circumstances for people. For others, it may be marching against the government in order to raise an issue that the government is not listening to. It could involve demonstrations and social action and political engagement at a very high level, but it could also involve you sitting quietly at home and praying on behalf of standing in the gap for other people who are in need. Friends, in this time of COVID, where we need to be praying against this virus, but in addition to that, we need to be thinking about the impact that shutdown and the virus itself, in terms of its loss of life, has on human society and on the world itself. And we need to start praying and advocating for these kinds of things. So people who are going hungry, people who are unable to get medical care, people whose education is suffering as a result, people who need health services in their home, someone to take care of them, people who are lonely, depressed, or anxious as a result of the shutdown. All of these are examples of where we could be standing in the gap, where we could do something with the gifts and the resources that God has given us, whatever those happen to be, that we use those things that God has given us to stand in the gap with those people with whom we have contact. So I do want to encourage you today to think about these two things. Who are the people in the sphere of your life space who need advocacy, I'm trying to find this word, who need advocacy or intercession, who need support? And what gifts and resources has God given you so that you could stand in the gap for them? And I pray that the Lord God will strengthen you and that he will strengthen me to do our part in standing in the gap.